Order, please. We'll now move on to oral questions put by members to ministers. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My questions for the Premier. This session was yet another demonstration of this government's absolute hubris when caught in a jam. As the FOIA pop crisis has unfolded, rather than take responsibility, the Premier has stuck to his talking points. Last Thursday, the Minister of Internal Services called the leak a criminal investigation, and I can table that. Yesterday, when asked if a criminal act had taken place, the Premier said, "Well, we'll see what happens with the information. That's not up to me." Will the Premier admit that in his haste to avoid responsibility for this crisis has only deepened the concern about his government's conduct?
The Honourable Premier.
No, Mr. Speaker, what I will tell the honourable member, when an activity is brought to us that potentially has a criminal implication to it, Mr. Speaker, we do the appropriate thing, which is called into the police, Mr. Speaker. The police now will do their investigation.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, it's not just the opposition that thinks this government has been negligent. It's not just information security experts that think this either. It's actually lawyer Ray Wagner, who announced this week that he's investigating opening a class action lawsuit against this government. He said that, and I quote, "Very concerning that this highly sensitive information was compromised and accessed so easily," and I can table that as well. "This government has exposed Nova Scotian taxpayers to a significant financial liability." Is the Premier at all concerned that he has put taxpayers on the hook for undermining damages and legal fees, all because his government failed to do their job?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. I actually watched the interview that Mr. Wagner was on CTV, Mr. Speaker, when he actually spoke about the potential lawsuit. Didn't know if there would be one, Mr. Speaker, depending on the interest of those out there. But he also said, Mr. Speaker, what he also said was he understood why, Mr. Speaker, that we made sure that we had a hold of the hardware so nothing would be damaged to contain the leak, Mr. Speaker. I absolutely agreed with him on that point, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
The Premier and his minister kept reciting the same talking points about protocols, but all we're hearing now is panic. He told media that the individual arrested had made changes to the FOIA portal, that these statements have been repeatedly disproven by internal services and information security experts. The Premier told media that the individual made changes to the code to get in to the FOIA portal, which we all know is not true. This is also inconsistent with what internal services actually confirmed as well. So, if police make the determination that no private information was disseminated by this individual, who will the Premier commit to holding accountable? Perhaps himself?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I'm accountable every day, Mr. Speaker, in this House and outside the House, to the good people of Nova Scotia. But, Mr. Speaker, what I will say to
the Honourable Premier has the floor.
Speaker, what I will say to the honourable member and the members of the opposition, Mr. Speaker, if the police come back with the very information she's talking about, that this information was not disseminated beyond the profile that we picked up, Mr. Speaker, I hope the honourable member will stand up and say the government did the right thing by protecting the information of Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, if we were to pinpoint on a map of Nova Scotia all the communities that have suffered closure of their emergency rooms in their hospitals since we began this session on the 27th of February, we would do a lot of pinpointing. Annapolis Royal, Sheet Harbour, Middle Musquodoboit, Tatamagouche, Pugwash, Parsboro, Spring Hill, Strait Richmond, Bedeck, New Waterford, Glace Bay, North Sydney. And so as the session comes to a close today, I want to ask the Premier this. Can he name one, anyone, just one, of these communities where the situation of ER closures is one bit better today than it was when he came to power?
The Honourable Premier.
Yeah, Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. Mr. Speaker, I think the that we're hearing from Nova Scotia across the communities. The healthcare workers, she mentioned Tattamagush, we know they get a full complement of physicians that are working. Soldiers Memorial Hospital, which the honourable member would know. I heard him reference Annapolis, which is also in my riding, Mr. Speaker. They seem very encouraged with the representation they had and the work that's ongoing. I want to thank the many people across the communities who continue to work with us. We've worked with the communities from one end of this province. We know, Mr. Speaker, there is more work to do. The honourable member has raised this important issue many times. I thank him for bringing it up, and we're going to continue to work with our healthcare providers to make sure that we have the appropriate complement of healthcare teams across the province.
The honourable leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, yesterday the government completed the legislating of the second budget in a year, which has funded 0 new nursing home beds anywhere in Nova Scotia. And the result is that 1 in 5, 21% of the hospital beds in the province today are filled with seniors waiting for placement in a nursing home. Now, every time I have asked the Premier about this through this session, he has responded about home care or about the wait list. But I want to challenge the Premier to answer this simple question without reference to the wait lists or to home care. Can he name a single healthcare professional in the province who thinks that 1 in 5 hospital beds being filled with non-hospital patients is an efficient or an appropriate use of our hospital resources?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the challenge with the honourable member's question, Mr. Speaker, you can't look at one aspect of delivering health care without looking at it in a totality, Mr. Speaker. Of course, it's important that we invest in home care. The honourable member should know that, because the people that he is talking to and his constituents and all Nova Scotia will tell him and tell all of us they want to remain home as long as possible. That's why we've continued to reduce the list. Mr. Speaker, and I said before in this House, the honourable member, we'll continue to look where long-term care beds are required in the province, Mr. Speaker, and if it's deemed, Mr. Speaker, that the challenge or the opportunities that we've taken to work on with home care and reducing long-term care lists, we'll make those investments at the appropriate time.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Here's one aspect that people would like the government to look at. On the day when the first session of this government's second mandate closed, that was last October, the number of people on the official registry of people looking for a family doctor was 37,339. Today, as this session closes, there are 44,158 people on that list. So I want to ask the Premier, why would anybody think his government has a credible handle and grasp on the doctor shortage when from just one legislative session to the next legislative session, there are 7,000 new people on that list?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. He raises a very important issue and identifies the challenge, Mr. Speaker, with as we deal with this issue, Mr. Speaker, in one community we're having retirements in another where we're having that wait list grow. Quite frankly, it is too many. I hear the members of the official opposition. I want to answer the honourable member's question because he answered in a thoughtful way and he's listened respectfully. I would encourage the official opposition to do the same thing, Mr. Speaker. This is an important question, Mr. Speaker.
Order, please. The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to answer the honourable member's question. The fact of the matter is the issue that he raises in this House is a real challenge. As we continue, Mr. Speaker, to deal with the issue in some communities, we're seeing it in others. The fact of the matter is, Mr. Speaker, there had been a physician resource plan that identified, and they were basing solely on age, that physicians would retire in this pace. Well, that's not the reality that's happening inside of our province, Mr. Speaker. We've discovered that new physicians that are coming in want to have a smaller practice and want to practice differently. So the honourable member raised a very important issue. We're working with Doctors Nova Scotia to continue to make sure we address the very important thing you brought to the floor of the House today.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Questions for the Premier. In late March, we learned that the Canadian Federation of Students had made the Minister of Labour and Advanced Education angry and that he was prepared to retaliate. At the time, the Premier said members of Students Nova Scotia were optimistic about their future here in Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, I doubt that these young people are optimistic about a province where the consequences of speaking their minds is being excluded from the Sexual Violence Prevention Committee. It is becoming a disturbing pattern that this government only listens to the voices that agree with them. Will the Premier admit it is absolutely unacceptable to punish young people for speaking out about sexual violence?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the fact of the matter is the very young people she's talking about met with senior staff inside of the department. The minister has made arrangements, Mr. Speaker, to meet with them. But I want to assure the honourable member that those students are optimistic about the future of the province. And Mr. Speaker says they'll take our word for it, Mr. Speaker. More young people are staying in this province since 1990, Mr. Speaker. More people see a future for themselves. The out migration that happened under the Conservative Party, Mr. Speaker, is no longer happening in Nova Scotia because those very students are working with their government for an optimistic look at our future.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the point is they're not letting the students have a voice. No. Mr. Speaker, all these students did was dare to try to hold the Minister of Labour and Advanced Education accountable. It is possible that they hold a different view, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I believe it is terrible for the government to make this mistake, to try and silence any group that wants to contribute to the betterment of our province. While the CFS has been shut out of the first meeting of the Sexual Violence Prevention Committee, it's not too late for this government to do the right thing. So will the Premier direct the Minister of Labour and Advanced Education to extend an invitation to the Canadian Federation of Students to attend the next meeting?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the fact of the matter is, Mr. Speaker, a question is absolutely wrong, Mr. Speaker. Student representatives are being represented, Mr. Speaker. The fact of the matter is, facts should matter in this place, Mr. Speaker, and the reality of it is they've been invited to that meeting, Mr. Speaker. Their representatives have been invited to that meeting. We're going to continue to work with students to provide them with hope, Mr. Speaker, that there's jobs in this province for them to build a future for themselves, Mr. Speaker. All of, Mr. Speaker, the rhetoric that came out of the Conservatives when they had an opportunity to do something for those students, Mr. Speaker, is long gone. Those students have an optimistic view of this province.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, my question for the Minister of Internal Services. The Office of the Auditor General of Nova Scotia audited the Unisys-managed computer system used by the government back in 2015. The AG report that the provincial contracts with service providers are supposed to include terms to meet the province's IT security policies and standards. However, Mr. Speaker, the contract with Unisys did not include these terms. Now we know that the private information of hundreds of Nova Scotians was being stored on a website that was not properly secured, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to ask the Minister, can the Minister explain why the contract with Unisys did not include the requirement to meet the government's own IT security policy and standards?
The Honourable Minister of Internal Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to assure the member that we are focused. We take this incident with the FOIPOP website very seriously. We are focusing now on contacting those individuals, finishing up the contacts, and investigating what we can do to make sure that we can get our site up and running, and in contract and in talks with Unisys in terms of our other contracts.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, the contract with Unisys did require the company to provide the government with monthly performance reports. The AG found no evidence that the Department of Internal Services were reviewing these reports, Mr. Speaker. The site was not properly secured. The monthly performance reports were not being reviewed. The loss of personal information was discovered by accident a month after it occurred, Mr. Speaker. So can the Minister explain how all these things were able to happen within a government department responsible for handling such sensitive information?
The Honourable Minister of Internal Services.
I'd like to thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to assure the member through you that we do take the recommendations of the Auditor General very seriously, and of the recommendations, those that were not completed are still in progress.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Education. Last week we learned that the new South End Halifax Elementary School will come equipped with something called a lockdown enunciation system. If activated, this system will flash strobe lights and emit warning signals. The doors to the school will lock automatically, and a large sign outside will read in capital letters, "School in lockdown, do not enter." And I'll table that, Mr. Speaker. I don't think it's unfair to say this process, launched by pushing a blue button, would cause some distress to children between the ages of 5 and 12. So I'd like to ask the Minister this. Is there a specific public safety risk that caused the Minister's Regional Education Centre to seek a lockdown annunciation system in a residential Halifax neighbourhood. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We have seen incidents across the province in relation to threats of gun violence. And obviously, we want to ensure that our schools are the safest possible for our students, for our kids. And this program is one that is being implemented in a number of schools across the province, particularly new ones that are being built. Thank you.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Speaker, apparently the minister is concerned enough about the need for lockdowns in schools, and we're installing strobe lights and billboards. I'm sure this would come as a surprise and concern to some parents. Since the news about this South End school, the Department of Education has indicated 13 more schools will soon have lockdown warning systems, and I'll table that, Mr. Speaker. This is just a fraction of the public schools that the minister now oversees, and I'm sure many parents are wondering why some schools are more prone to lockdowns than others. My question is this, Mr. Speaker. If the school lockdown alarm is such a priority for student safety, will the regional education centres be retrofitting every school in our province with lockdown alarms and signage? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In terms of these operational directives, we are taking the lead from those who have been the lead on operational matters throughout the history of this system. This is an accepted safety practice and program that is being implemented across North America, Mr. Speaker, and we're happy to benefit from the safest schools possible in this province. Thank you.
The honourable member for Northside Westmount.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is the Minister of Health and Wellness. As I pointed out before, Mr. Speaker, the possible closure of the Northside General could have a devastating impact on the community in the North Side. But now we have some numbers on just how significant that impact could be. Through March 2018, of the 10,293 patients seen, over 1/3 were assessed as higher acuity, meaning they were ill, very ill, and needed immediate care. But the North Side is open only 1/3 of the time, Mr. Speaker. So that's 1/3 of the calendar year to see 1/3 of the patients in the most need of care. So my question to the Minister is, what is the plan to provide priority care to those 1/3 of the patients if the North Side General is closed?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member for raising the question. Indeed, we take numerous steps to improve access to care for all Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker. One of those steps, of course, is recruitment initiatives, Mr. Speaker, for the Cape Breton area, for other parts of the province. We continue that work with our partners, the Health Authority. And, Mr. Speaker, we look forward to seeing those improvements in primary care to also reduce some of the pressure at our emergency departments throughout the province.
The honourable member for Northside Westmount.
Mr. Speaker, the numbers don't lie. The Minister doesn't seem to be able to make sense of the clear numbers coming out of the North Side situation. He has the same numbers as we have, Mr. Speaker, yet he still has no definite plan. Paying doctors at the North Side $30 less an hour than Cape Breton Regional Hospital is undermining the emergency room at the North Side General. That's increasing the strain at the Cape Breton Regional Hospital, and as we heard here last week, also the Victoria County Memorial Hospital, and meaning more of these acute patients can't get the proper care in a timely manner. So if the Minister does have a plan for the North Side, will he outline it in person at the upcoming rally on April the 28th? Otherwise, is his plan simply to close the North Side General Hospital as a year? Yes or no? I don't need any more how good they're doing, Mr. Speaker. I want a yes or no answer.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I continue to recognize the challenges that we have in our healthcare system.
Order, please. The Honourable Minister of Health.
And that's why we continue to make...
order, please. The Honourable Member for Northside Westmount will come to order. The Honourable Minister of Health.
That we continue to invest in this priority area, Mr. Speaker, and we'll continue to do so.
The Honourable Member for Queens Shelburne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Health and Wellness. 2 Sundays ago, I received a message that a canoe containing 2 individuals capsized in Liverpool Harbour. Thankfully, the local fire department's quick action rescued both individuals from the frigid waters. But because of severe hypothermia, one of the individuals had to be transported to Queen's General. And guess what, Mr. Speaker? There were no ambulances available in the county. So this individual had to be transported to the hospital in the back of a van. My question to the Minister is, Does the minister believe it is right to throw someone in need of urgent medical attention in the back of a van for transport to the nearest hospital?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Not at all. That's not an acceptable situation. I'll certainly, if the member brings further details to my attention, we'll certainly be delving into the specifics of that situation.
The Honourable Member for Queens Shelburne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the minister for that response, and I certainly will discuss that with him. Many constituents in Queens County are waiting months to see family physicians, and this is no fault of the medical staff. They are simply struggling to keep up with a system that is under strain. Since Roseway ER is closed more often than not, many constituents in Shelburne County are forced to look for care at Queens General. It is becoming overwhelming for physicians to manage the needs of both counties. My question to the minister is, when will appropriate resources be in place to provide care for constituents of Shelburne County in Shelburne County? And in the meantime, how will the minister support physicians in Queens County while they continue to fill the gaps?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A number of questions there. I'll try to address them in order. Number one, Mr. Speaker, it's important to recognize that the most recent ER closure report published in December shows significant improvement at the Roseway Hospital. I believe it's over 1,200 or 1,400 hours in 16 and stands at 400. Still too much, Mr. Speaker, but we continue to work on that. We're seeing improvements. Mr. Speaker, we know that there's more family physicians in that area now than there has been in about 2 decades, Mr. Speaker, supporting on the primary care side of the equation. Mr. Speaker, we continue to invest and the resources are available, Mr. Speaker, to recruit physicians, not just to those communities, but in communities right across this province, Mr. Speaker, and we're continuing those efforts to find and improve primary care access for all Nova Scotians.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Needham.
Mr. Speaker, my question is also for the Minister of Health and Wellness. Earlier this month, I heard from a constituent who is concerned about the decline in services for people recovering from addictions. In Halifax, until recently, those needing support could join one of several discussion groups that met weekly. You didn't need a referral or a diagnosis, you just needed to be a person looking for help. But the number of sessions offered has been cut back over the last number of years, and participants in the Bayers Road Clinic group are worried it won't be long before it too is on the chopping block. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask the Minister, does he think that cutting support for these sorts of group programs will help the mental health of Nova Scotians?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I do appreciate the member raising this very important topic. We speak a lot about mental health concerns in this area, perhaps a little less about addictions. Obviously, a relationship often coexisting with individuals. Pleased to let the member know that mental health and addictions are a priority for this government. We made significant investments in our harm reduction, our opioid framework, Mr. Speaker. We continue to invest and pursue, based upon advice and recommendations from the frontline clinical staff, Mr. Speaker, who advise us, and we've adopted and we've invested in those recommendations to improve care for and treatment options for those with various addiction disorders.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Needham.
Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians recovering from all sorts of addictions need support. Last year, the group meeting in Dartmouth stopped running, and in October, Halifax lost its second last support group, leaving the region with just one. Mr. Speaker, these support groups are crucial not just for people recovering from addictions, but also for their friends and family. Will the minister commit to reinstating these important services?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm certainly happy to follow up with the member opposite. Based on the information that's brought to the floor at this point, it's not clear that those particular services she's referring to were ever government, specifically government services, or if they were community groups and volunteers that were offering the services. So we'll certainly follow up with the member to investigate on that regard, to confirm if they were services and programs offered by the province or our partner with the Nova Scotia Health Authority. But again, I want to reassure the member and all members of the legislature that our commitment to mental health and addictions is one of our top priorities, and we continue to invest in those areas. And we know, recognize, and value the role that our partners in the community providing support to not just those with addictions and mental health challenges, but also their loved ones as well.
The Honourable Member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Transportation. This coming weekend, the Nova Centre will host a National Liberal Convention. Wait for it. Wait for it. Wait for it. Last month, I asked the minister about the Nova Centre lease and operating agreement signed by the province. The announcement around that agreement articulated an annual payment of $5,380,000 and an additional monthly operating fee of $82,188. Mr. Speaker, we've done the math, and the math on that works out to $159 million for the full 25 years. $100 million more than the government announced as their commitment of $58.9 million when the original promise was made. Before the party starts, and it sounds like it may have started already, but before the party starts, will the minister explain how he managed to triple the price of the Nova Centre?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I really thank the member opposite for the question, particularly in pointing out the utility of that great facility to handle massive conventions such as the National Liberal Convention, and I might point out is also going to host the National Conservative Convention later on in the year, which gives this city and this province a national ability to generate revenues for the province. The numbers that the minister quotes is the amortized value over the life of the facility, and is the in-plan money that was designed to support this tremendous investment.
The Honourable Member for Pictou East.
Mr. Speaker, we have so many questions about how the price escalated so quickly, and there's other questions too. We're questioning whether a former Prime Minister may come all the way here to talk about how large his family is, Mr. Speaker. Maybe the current Prime Minister will be wearing a kilt or a sou'western, who knows? Maybe both. But in response to the question last time I asked about this, the Minister said that the numbers the member is quoting are gross numbers, and I certainly agree, Mr. Speaker.
Order, please. The Honourable Member for Pictou East.
We agree, Mr. Speaker. The numbers are pretty gross. The minister went on to insist at that time that the lease will only cost the province the original commitment of $58.9 million, a figure that's not supported by the actual numbers, Mr. Speaker. My question is, can the minister tell this House, when it's all said and done, how much will the Nova Centre cost the province?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank the member for the question. The numbers that he quotes are representing 1/3 of the contribution from the province of approximately $59 million, and over time, the revenues that are generated for this by this facility for the province of Nova Scotia won't be a cost. It'll be a good investment for the taxpayers' money of this province.
The Honourable Member for Kings North.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Agriculture. The Nova Scotia Federation of Agriculture put out a press release which I will table entitled Small Farms Abandoned. The press release noticed that the department had recently announced programs to support Nova Scotia's agriculture and agri-food sectors. While there are major flaws in the eligibility for these programs, Mr. Speaker, the most obvious change from the past is the increase in farm revenue minimum from $30,000 to $30,000 from $10,000. Leaders in the industry were assured by representatives from the Minister's Department in a meeting in February that program support for the growth of farms with gross revenues under $30,000 were in the works and would be released. And the NSFA is disappointed that the program isn't yet available. So my question for the Minister is, will he reinstate the $10,000 farm revenue threshold or announce the promised program for the many small farms in our province under $30,000 gross revenue?
The Honourable Minister of Agriculture.
Thank you very much for the question. And indeed, there was a plan, and the Federation of Agriculture is very familiar with the plan we've got in place to shift from 10,000 to 30,000, and there's a program being in place to address the 10,000 to 30,000 small farms, to get them up to larger farms. That's all been discussed with the industry. It has not been announced yet. We're putting the final touches on it, but it is coming.
The Honourable Member for Kings North.
So's planting season, Mr. Speaker, coming quickly. Mr. Speaker, in addition to the increase in the minimum gross farm revenue, specific program details are alarming. Based on financial assistance available under the Soil and Water Sustainability Program, it's evident that protecting the environment is not a priority for this government, according to the NSFA. For other programs, eligible items and activities indirectly hamper growth of many sectors. For example, missions and investigative travel program applies to farms that are ready to export, which precludes all meat processors in the province. And NSA President Victor Olten said a healthy environment is good for the public good, and he's not happy with it. Mr. Speaker, my question, will the minister review the program criteria to address these serious concerns about support for environmental issues and abattoirs?
The Honourable Minister of Agriculture.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And indeed, in the new program, there is a program in place for environmental issues. And actually, that's a misquote in the press release, because the only abattoirs that are allowed to export anything out of this province, and you would know that, have to be CFIA approved, and we only have one in the province, 2 in the province. That's it. I'm just going to read you a letter that I sent to the Federation of Agriculture, to Victor Olten, this morning. This is further to our telephone conversation this morning, in which you raised concerns with the programs released on Monday, April 16, 2018, under the new Canadian Agriculture Partnership. Based on your concerns in your press release that we received this morning and our telephone call, I placed a hold on all Canadian agriculture partnership programs for 30 days. This is to ensure that before we move forward with any program, we will have the opportunity to review your concerns to fully understand them, ensure that the programs are meeting the industry's needs.
Could the Honourable Minister table that document, please? We have to move along here. The Honourable Member for Inverness.
It's okay, Mr. Speaker. I have another question there for the Minister of Fisheries. Mr. Speaker, I'm concerned about the recent decision by the government to implement a freeze on issuing new seafood buyer and processing licenses. Mr. Speaker, I'm concerned about the free market. Why don't we want to have a free market? All of the power is in the minister's hands. By limiting the number of buyers and processors, the minister is creating a closed system that will only protect the current buyers at the expense of Nova Scotia fishers. Consider, Mr. Speaker, fewer buyers, less competition, lower prices for fishermen and fisherwomen. Mr. Speaker, I can think of somebody who had been introduced in the audience just last week who is a buyer who's very happy with the new policy because it's helpful to that individual. Why does the minister want a closed system that disadvantages Nova Scotia fishers?
The Honourable Minister of Fisheries.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the member for the question. And indeed, it's a temporary freeze. It's a freeze that was suggested by the industry itself. And we're reviewing the licensing policy, and there's some old grandfathering system in it. There's actually 300 buyer's licenses in the province now, of which is only 154 in use.
The Honourable Member for Inverness.
I would ask, Mr. Speaker, which part of the industry? I know when I mentioned the individual in the gallery to a few fishermen around home, they were not too happy, Mr. Speaker. We see this type of decision-making in the new aquaculture regulations, where the minister has the power to decide if a company can even submit an aquaculture lease application instead of leaving it with an independent review board. Mr. Speaker, fewer buyers in the marketplace can squeeze the fishermen and fisherwomen, can lead to collusion. Mr. Speaker, which has often been a fear amongst fishers. It may not change the export value in terms of the end product being sold. However, Mr. Speaker, it may affect the money that lands in fishers' pockets. So, Mr. Speaker, will the minister continue to place himself in a position of conflict with those owners of licenses, or will he open this up to the free market?
The Honourable Minister of Fisheries.
Indeed, through the process here, over the years, the fisheries licensing operation we have through the buyer's license and the processing licenses has been a real schmozzle, to say the least. And based on requirements and requests from the industry, we've put a temporary freeze on licenses. There was no set decision exactly what we're going to do at this point. We're going to take consultation from fishermen, from buyers and processors in the province before a decision is made how it's going to move forward from that point.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth South.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Municipal Affairs. When Sobeys closed its North Woodside location in Dartmouth in 2009, residents were left without a full-service grocery. The community would love to have another store in the old Sobeys location, and there are thousands of people who live nearby. Unfortunately, they have to wait until 2030 for that to happen, because when Sobeys sold the old mall, it included a restrictive covenant that prohibits any other grocery stores, convenience stores, drug stores, or medical clinics from setting up for 20 years. This has left the mall over half empty for a decade. Residents are understandably baffled and upset that our laws allow for such anti-competitive actions that so clearly hurt the public good. I'd like to ask the Minister, what will he do to fix these loopholes and help North Woodside get a grocery store again?
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the member for the question. I don't have any detail on that current situation. That on the surface, listening to the comments, that would be a private contract. But of course, with any matter that comes across my desk from any member of this House, more than happy to sit down and have a further conversation.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth South.
Mr. Speaker, food insecurity is a major challenge in Nova Scotia and in the HRM, and one which we've brought up repeatedly. In 2015, the Halifax Food Policy Alliance reported that Halifax is rated highest in household food security among 33 Canadian cities, and the rate of food security has been going up. The main cause of that insecurity is poverty, but a significant contributing factor are the many neighbourhoods that don't have nearby grocery stores. The Halifax City Council has tried to tackle that issue with a mobile food market initiative, but it would help the city to know that there won't be any restrictive covenants allowed contributing to food deserts. Will the minister commit to nullifying these types of restrictive covenants and their legality so that the residents of North Woodside don't have to wait another 12 years for a grocery store?
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Again, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank the member for the question. I can't get involved with a private matter or a private deal, but what I always try to do with the municipal units that I work with across the province is ensure that we create as much flexibility and as much legislative power as possible for them to be flexible in providing the supports and services to the communities that they represent. I make that commitment to that member and all members of this legislature that as I move forward in this portfolio, we'll do whatever we can to work with our municipal partners to ensure that we can play a part in making their communities and their residents as prosperous as possible.
The Honourable Member for Cumberland North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 2 years ago, the Premier announced Nova Scotia's China engagement strategy. The strategy made specific reference to the opportunity to expand the value and volume of wild blueberry exports to China, and I'll table that document. I have a question. Will the Premier update the House on what he and his government have done over the past 2 years to increase wild blueberry exports to China and the results of those results?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll ask the Minister of Agriculture to wax eloquently on this file.
The Honourable Minister of Agriculture.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that question. Actually, it's a very good news story. We've been working in China and in Asia, new markets for blueberries, and indeed the sales of blueberries have gone exponentially, up exponentially. One trip, the last trip I was on some months ago, we sold 50 container loads in one trip. It's huge.
The Honourable Member for Cumberland North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the Minister for sharing that. It does sound very good. Unfortunately, the blueberry growers in Cumberland County haven't seen those results, and even last season, many blueberry farmers left the blueberries in the field because the prices consistently the last 2 or 3 years, 3 or 4 years, has been so low it doesn't make sense to even harvest. So this in part is because it's the significant increase in production. So there is a role for us to find new major markets like China. Will the Premier or the Minister of Agriculture make Nova Scotia wild blueberries a significant part of its next trade mission to China?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to assure the Honourable Member that every trade mission that I've been on, whether it's been in China, Mr. Speaker, whether it's been in the eastern U.S. or in Europe, Mr. Speaker, I'm very proud to identify we're the home to the world's largest wild blueberry producer here at Oxford. Nova Scotia, the fact that we've got the world-class product, Mr. Speaker, and it's why I'm so proud of the work that the Minister of Agriculture and Fisheries has been doing to continue to make sure that we open up markets so that we get the right price for that high-quality food, Mr. Speaker. We continue very proud of what's happened. Those of us who live in coastal communities know what it means when we get the right price for lobster. It's the exact same thing in the blueberry country. We need to make sure that we get the right price, and by doing that, we go out and find those markets and promote the fact that we have the best product in the world.
The honourable member for Pictou Centre.
Mr. Speaker, we are all aware that there's 100,000 Nova Scotians looking for a family doctor. Meanwhile, the Nova Scotia Health Authority failed to send any recruiters to a rural medicine conference in St. John's attended by 600 medical students, residents, and family doctors. The minister's inaction on this file is causing undue stress for many Nova Scotians who get bounced around from nurse practitioners to walk-in clinics and then are forced to wait 6 to 10 hours in an emergency room to finally see a doctor. Question to the Minister of Health: why does the minister tolerate a two-tier health care system for those Nova Scotians living without a family doctor and those fortunate enough to have one?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I assure the member opposite that this file, primary care access for Nova Scotians, is not one that has sat idle by this government, nor myself, and since I've taken the role of Minister of Health. Mr. Speaker, we've taken numerous steps to improve access to primary care in the province of Nova Scotia. We're expanding our collaborative care practices. Just earlier in March, Mr. Speaker, we announced expansion of existing practices as well as 7 new collaborative care teams. In addition to that, almost $40 million we worked out with the new programs to support family physicians, Mr. Speaker. All of that because we know family physicians represent the backbone of these collaborative teams, along with other healthcare providers, Mr. Speaker, that never received the level of support that they've received under our government, and we continue to do that, Mr. Speaker, provide care for all Nova Scotians.
The honourable member for Pictou Centre.
Mr. Speaker, during this current week, 3 constituents visited my office, 2 looking for some assistance with their mental health issues and waiting long hours in the waiting room at a local hospital. The third one, a young adult, suffered a severe seizure a few days ago. As a result, he had to call his employer in Alberta and inform them he would not be able to report to work because his driver's license was taken away and his job requires him to drive from job site to job site. Unfortunately, he does not have a doctor, and he's having trouble obtaining a doctor's referral to have the necessary tests to obtain the proper medicine so he can return to work. My question: does the minister not see how his inaction is addressing Nova Scotia's doctor crisis, is causing significant hardship for those in dire need of a family doctor?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I recognize full well the challenges primary care access in communities and for those individuals without primary care access. Mr. Speaker, for those Nova Scotians who do have a primary care provider, family physician, or a collaborative practice that may include a nurse practitioner's nurse or family practice nurses, Mr. Speaker, don't know exactly what it's like for those Nova Scotians who don't have the primary care service provider that they can rely on in times of need. And that's why, Mr. Speaker, we continue to invest in expanding mental health services. It's why we continue to expand and invest in collaborative care practices. And, Mr. Speaker, it's why we continue to work with doctors, Nova Scotia, and other frontline healthcare professionals to find the right compensation model to ensure we retain and recruit.
The honourable member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Health. Mr. Speaker, as the Minister knows, My Health Nova Scotia is an online service that allows Nova Scotians to review their health information online, including test results. In theory, this is an excellent service. However, it is critically flawed because it will not allow all Nova Scotians, especially those without a family doctor, to access this information. This means that we have thousands of Nova Scotians who could be getting their test results online, which would additionally reduce the strain on an already strained system. My question to the Minister is, why can't Nova Scotians without a family doctor register for My Health Nova Scotia so they can get their test results online? Thank you.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The configuration of the system does have it set up to integrate not just with testing systems, but through family practice sites. They're what are called EMR, or electronic medical record systems, which would be in the primary care providers' offices, Mr. Speaker. That's to ensure that the providers are able to provide an overview and connect and interact with the patients on the other end. In fact, Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to remind the member of the investments that we've made and the program that we've established to actually incent more physicians to get engaged and make use of this technology to make it available to more Nova Scotians through more practices, and also to expand their use of non-face-to-face interaction through technology, Mr. Speaker. A lot of investment, a lot of work being done here with our partners on the front line.
The honourable member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for that answer. But it's not just the patients who don't have a family doctor that can't view their medical information online. My Health Nova Scotia requires that a doctor registers, as the Minister just said. But this means that someone like me who has health training and who has a family doctor but has to wait quite a long time to get into them won't get any benefit from the system because my doctor has opted out. If automatic registration occurred and doctors could then consent to releasing the test information to patients who are on their caseload, and we could certainly change the system of the EMR to allow those without a family doctor to do so, and I know a 19-year-old who could probably help you set that system up, we'd be cutting down on a lot more of unnecessary doctor visits. So, will the Minister look at modifying My Health Nova Scotia for that 100,000 Nova Scotians who don't have a family doctor and who can't get their results at walk-in clinic visits?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased to advise the member that there's a lot of work actually ongoing, upgrading and modernizing the IT infrastructure within the healthcare system of Nova Scotia to ensure that access to the information, the health information of Nova Scotians, is available to the right healthcare professional at the right time, as well as the patients themselves. This includes a number of initiatives, Mr. Speaker, to integrate and establish one of the largest would be the One Patient, One Record initiative, Mr. Speaker, but it also includes upgrades in physician offices in the EMR system, the My Health system, Mr. Speaker, wide range of technology initiatives, and throughout that process we'll certainly be looking to ensure that we're going with the right process to ensure the maximum benefit for all Nova Scotians and their healthcare providers.
The honourable member for Cape Breton Centre.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Health and Wellness. On the South Shore, Lyme disease is a major public health issue. People who don't get treatment in time suffer from post-Lyme disease syndrome, which is characterized by chronic fatigue, pain, and cognitive issues. It can be life-changing and in many cases debilitating. Mr. Speaker, we've heard the Minister say that the Department is following the national guidelines around the assessment and treatment of tick-related Lyme disease, but I'm worried that people without family doctors aren't getting a diagnosis in time. What is the Minister doing to ensure that people can get treatment before it's too late?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for raising this question, especially as we proceed into the spring weather, Mr. Speaker. It's important for all Nova Scotians to be aware that, in fact, tick-borne illnesses like Lyme disease are on the rise in Nova Scotia, in a large part due to the warmer climate and the prevalence of the tick, the deer tick, Mr. Speaker. As far as the treatment awareness is number one, Mr. Speaker. Prevention is obviously the best first step. Beyond that, the education and the awareness with our medical professionals to provide that information, to be aware and help follow those guidelines, Mr. Speaker. So all those steps are being taken to help inform and aware Nova Scotians and visitors of the risks, as also how to identify and seek treatment, and then with our frontline healthcare providers, of course, Mr. Speaker, to follow the national guidelines.
The honourable member for Cape Breton Centre.
Mr. Speaker, the number of Lyme disease cases reported in Nova Scotia is on the rise. Last year, there were 326, almost one-third of the number of reported cases in the entire country. Nova Scotia reported the highest incidence in Canada in 2016, 12.7 times higher than the national average. Mr. Speaker, will the Minister acknowledge that Lyme disease is a public health care crisis in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As is the case when jurisdictions undertake education initiatives and awareness campaigns, Mr. Speaker, obviously awareness and reported incidents would be expected to be higher. So we recognize that the prevalence and the growth is recognized to be entering and emerging from the Atlantic region, Mr. Speaker, in particular Nova Scotia. So that has a contribution, but also our efforts to build awareness, I think, is a contributing factor as to why we see those numbers so high in Nova Scotia. And I think that just goes to show that we have more work to do. And that's why I'd like to acknowledge the work that our partners like Doctors Nova Scotia with professional development initiatives to help again inform our frontline healthcare providers.
The honourable member for Kings North.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Fisheries. The Government of Canada has made a commitment to protect 10% of Canada's marine and coastal areas by 2020. It's come to our attention that the DFO are considering the Eastern Shore Islands area that covers 2,000 square kilometres. And most of LFA 32 that's a strong candidate for the next coastal MPA, and the area is vital to Nova Scotia's fishing industry. Is the Minister of Fisheries aware that LFA 32 might be lost as a fishing ground, and does he agree with this direction and decision of the DFO?
The Honourable Minister of Fisheries.
Thank you very much. We have been working very closely with the fisheries organization in that area. They're very concerned about the possibilities of having some no-fish zones in that area, and we'll work with them closely to ensure that their views are known to DFO.
The honourable member for Kings North.
Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotia is Canada's leading seafood exporter with $1.8 billion sold in global markets. And once DFO designated a marine protected area, there's what's called a no-take zone. The people in the area are genuinely concerned. Is the minister prepared to stand up for Nova Scotian harvesters, go to Ottawa and tell the Federal Minister of Fisheries and Oceans to leave this area alone?
The Honourable Minister of Fisheries.
Thank you very much. We are very concerned about, as a fisherman in that area, and I've actually met with them personally on this matter, and we are formulating a responsible multi-department response on this. And
order, please. The time allotted for oral questions put by members to ministers has expired.